thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I'm so happy to be here to speak about this great book with Anne. And it's a real pleasure to read this book because it's a big picture book, and it gives us a kind of different view of authoritarians. There's lots of studies about individual regimes, but this is about the connections, the networks that they are in. And it's not only why they develop their systems of disinformation and repression that they use on their own people, but how they share those and how there's like a circuit of sharing and technology that they use together. So it's a book about partnerships. And so I feel like we're living through a moment when these autocrats are in a way becoming more dependent on each other, and there's more sharing out of necessity also. Think about Russia's reliance on, foreign powers for weapons, for technology, and even enlisting the GOP to try and kind of game the aid, withholding aid, right, to Ukraine. So can you talk about this moment we're in and why you decided to take this approach in this book?
I will. And first I want to say thank you to the audience for coming, and also thank you to Ruth, who is one of the world authorities on authoritarianism. So, and we just were talking in the green room about the paucity of women in the field of authoritarianism, yeah, or even as authoritarians. So that makes us unique. So it's unique for me to be interviewed by someone like Ruth too. So thank you. For me, this is a subject. I wrote a previous book that developed out of my own life and my own experience. This book really developed out of other people's experience. So I have had over the years friends and acquaintances who've been part of democratic opposition movements, whether it was in Russia, whether it was in the Hong Kong democracy movement, whether it was in Venezuela. I have a Zimbabwean friend. I have a number of people who I've known, sometimes for a very long time, some since the 90s, who've been democracy activists. And I became aware in the last decade, and especially in recent years, that much of what they had been doing wasn't working anymore.
Yeah.
And so the ideas about how you organize, how you communicate, how you message, how you communicate, even though the ideas they were seeking to organize around were still as popular. So most people, you don't need America to promote democracy, or you don't need to translate, John Locke into Farsi, although I know somebody who did that. Most of the instinctive support for democracy or transparency movements comes from the experience of living in a dictatorship. So why do we not know how the economy works? Why are some people rich and in a completely opaque way that we can't perceive? Why did the police arrest me for something that feels unfair? It's usually the experience of injustice that pushes people in that direction rather than some knowledge of the history of democracy. So these are still popular ideas. In fact, they may be more popular in Venezuela than they are here. But they're still popular ideas, but the system, it wasn't working anymore. And I began to understand that as you just said, that the autocratic regimes also had understood that these ideas were popular, and they had begun to think more deeply about how to push back on them. Mm-hmm. So technologically, sort of with propaganda and information, and in other ways. And they were becoming more sophisticated in understanding this, because they perceive themselves, although we don't necessarily perceive ourselves this way, they perceive themselves as involved in a war of ideas. And it's a different one than what we're used to. So this is not an ideological bloc. They do not share a vision of the world. The theocrats in Iran and the communists in China and the Bolivarian socialists in Venezuela and the whatever they are in Russia, the kleptocrats in Russia, they don't share a common vision, right, but they feel a common threat, and the threat is from us. I mean, from our language, from the way we talk, not even necessarily from our foreign policy, sometimes maybe, and there's some, obviously, geopolitical competition, certainly between the US and China, but it's really about those ideas. And it began to come together, I think there was a big change in 2013, 2014, when Xi Jinping rose to the top of China and when Putin was very freaked out by the Ukrainian revolution. And that began this change, which began to solidify in recent years. And I think it was, as I began to understand, in a weird way, it was almost 2020, which is when the Belarusian opposition won an election and then had the election stolen and protested and came very close to winning, actually. And were eventually crushed, not just by Putin, not just by their own dictator, but he had help from Russia, he had help from China, he eventually had help from Iran, he eventually had this, almost sort of network of dictators around him who helped to keep him in power. This is Lukashenko, the Belarusian dictator. And when I understood that, I understood that we're absent those outside forces, he would have lost. I mean, he was unpopular, he lost an election. Most of his apparatus probably wanted to change the system. The journalists wanted to change the system. A lot of the army wanted to change the system, but they were up against not just him, but this kind of apparatus of other network, rather, of other nations. So that was the reason for the book. And the timing, actually, funny enough, the book was somewhat delayed. My publisher's in the audience, so she knows this, but somewhat delayed by the war in Ukraine, because I initially didn't know how the war was going to play in this story or how it would. I wanted to write the book earlier. And then, of course, as the war progressed, I understood that Russia is very much relying on the network of autocracies too. So the timing is more appropriate than I had even thought it was.
And that, when you read the book, which I hope you all do, the example of Belarus it opens your eyes. For example, the Russians sent journalists over to Belarus to kind of do the propaganda properly, because it wasn't being done up to their standard, and they were afraid their candidate would lose.
The Belarusian state journalists actually either resigned or started or switched sides, and they were replaced literally by Russian journalists.
Yeah. So it's so special to talk with Anne, because we were saying not too many people are immersed in the heads of these awful individuals, and these are people who are entirely transactional beings. And as Anne makes clear in the book, they're not bound by ideals, as was the case in the fascists or the Cold War bloc. They do some of the same things. They torture people, all of that. They steal, but it's a different thing. And it can be difficult to understand just how transactional they are. If you think about, Putin and Erdogan, they're best friends, and they have a lunch, and one of their, whoever's hosting the lunch, they print, they make these special china plates with their pictures on them, and a week later they're not speaking, and they're saying they're going to go to war. It's just this crazy, it's this crazy kind of mercurial, right? These are people who are very impulsive, very vengeful, and so they're very transactional. And so, for example, closer to home, not everyone...
We're just at the beginning of this conversation. You went very fast,
I did. Well, because it's really, I've found it's really hard for people to understand individuals who have no ideals beyond, money and power. And that's part of the ink that I'd like you to talk about. But not everyone would pick as their vice president candidate somebody who had said they were like Hitler, right? And yet that doesn't matter in the transactional world, the transactional mentality, because that person, Vance, brings things. He's backed by a billionaire, Peter Thiel, and he brings things that are useful to Trump. And so when we get all outraged that, we can get Vance because he called Trump like Hitler, that's not how the Trumpers, not how the Trump tribe of leaders thinks. They couldn't care less. So that's an example of transactional, that I thought, is useful to know.
Yes, I actually had, I mean, maybe this was wrong of me, and because I can't prove it, but my instinct when I saw, it wasn't actually Thiel so much, it was Elon Musk and David Sachs were supporting Vance, and then immediately Musk made a huge donation to the Trump campaign immediately afterwards, $45 million a month, so it's $180 million, which is a lot. For me, anyway, maybe not for you guys. This is New York. So my immediate question was, what did they want in exchange? Yeah. And I, maybe that was maybe they are idealists, but I don't think so. No, so one of the things I was trying to explain in the book was that mentality. So whether it's and also the extremes of that mentality. So actually Venezuela is an interesting example. There's actually an election there in a couple of days. So the Venezuelan dictatorship, which Venezuela was the richest country in South America, now it's the poorest. It was a democracy, now it's not. It produces, by some counts, certainly a couple of years ago, it produced more refugees than Ukraine. So it was an impoverished country. And it fell apart. And yet the leaders, and the regime is extremely unpopular, and if there is a free election, I think it's on Sunday, they'll lose. But will it be, we don't know how the votes will be counted and so on. So, but think about the mentality of the leaders of Venezuela. So they would rather see their country decline to the point where it's the poorest country in the hemisphere, one of them. They would rather people starve. Yeah. They would rather that their country become a basket case, a failed state. They would rather have that than give up any power.
That's right.
And that mentality is one that we find hard to understand. I mean, it's a similar, not quite that extreme yet in Russia, but Putin would, when he prosecutes the war in Ukraine. It's not about, and when he thinks about foreign policy as well as domestic policy, he's not thinking about what's best for the Russian people. How do I increase their prosperity? How do I make people's lives better? He's thinking about himself, his legacy, and his power. So that he's used the war as an excuse for and a means of cracking down on society. He's limited freedom of speech and freedom of association. He's imposed new strictures and controls because it's a national emergency, which is, by the way, long tradition in Russian history that you do that. Yeah. And his interest is not in the well-being of ordinary Russians. And I think it took a long time for Western leaders to understand that. There was this mentality, why. Surely we can do a deal. Surely Putin wants what's best for the Russian nation. We can have an arrangement, and a lot of the pressure on him was, or diplomacy towards him rather, was aimed at that for many years. And it was really only recently that I think people finally understood. No, he doesn't care. That's not the point.
And it's disillusioning to think that people don't care to that extent, but. Not only they don't care, they also scorn, and you make this clear in the book, the entire international democratic notions of justice, of accountability, of transparency. They fear those things, but they scorn them. They're just not interested. So their ideals, their idea of governance is completely different than what we're used to thinking about. It's all, as Anne said, it's all about them. So one of the greatest things about this book is that it makes corruption and kleptocracy central. That's part of the Inc, Autocracy Inc. And I've been very frustrated, and it's an extension of what we've been saying. I feel like every time Putin's Russia is mentioned in the press, it should be called a kleptocracy, because that's the fuel of the entire, state machinery. But I find sometimes when I start talking about this, people's eyes glaze over. It's like you're at a dinner party, oh my God, kleptocracy again, and so they don't have it, and I think that people in democracies don't have a sense of when the entire state machinery is hijacked in a sense. Like Putin took Gazprom, and he and his cronies plundered it and took money out of it, and then it's called exfiltration, put that money out of the country into offshore finance, right? So the leader is plundering the state agencies. So
yeah,
and then
Gazprom, and then even the next stage then was that Gazprom became effectively an arm of the state. So it's a private company, which is, there was at one point, I'm not sure if this is still true, at one point the heads of Gazprom also had kind of like second jobs in the presidential administration. Yeah. So it was and Gazprom was used to do Russian foreign policy. That's right. So it was particularly regarding Germany and the pipeline building and so on. And there were, Gazprom sponsored a soccer team in Germany that was in the hometown of with the man who's now President Steinmeier, who was then the foreign minister. And I had a conversation, this is years ago, I had a conversation with him, and he said, oh, it's so interesting that Gazprom is sponsoring a football team in my town. I said, yeah, it's a big surprise. But that was a Gazprom foreign policy, and again, was that in Russia's interest, or was it in Putin's interest? I mean, if Putin was making, and his people around him were making money off of Gazprom, then that was the function of the company. So it had this dual role, and I think we find that hard to understand. But I also wanted to say about kleptocracy, we also have this idea that these are things that sort of money laundering and grand scale theft, these are things that happen in other countries. They happen in some dictatorship in the global south, or little Caribbean islands, or where they have tax havens. And we don't think about the degree to which our financial system in this country and in London, and in other European countries facilitate it. So the enablers of those tax havens and those money laundering schemes are very often in London or New York or elsewhere.
Wyoming.
Yeah, right. And so and then one of the punchlines is that there are a lot of American states, some of this is beginning to change, but there were a lot of American states that have laws that make it very easy to set up anonymously owned companies or anonymous trusts. And a lot of international money laundering or just the hiding of money for different kinds of reasons goes through anonymous companies. And I once asked admittedly it was a guy who was a kind of transparency campaigner. I said, so what's the reason why we need anonymous companies? And he said, people have reasons, and basically none of them amount to very much. I mean, it's an unnecessary. And that's just, I mean, either people are using it to hide from paying taxes, or they're using it to hide stolen money, or else maybe they're using it to hide money from their ex-wife. That's the other. Yeah. But it's not. But there's some very technical, legitimate reasons why you might do it, and there are I've been offered by banks, you can have an investment fund set up in the Virgin Islands or wherever. But so there are legitimate banks who do it. I mean, I'm not saying everybody's a crook who has their money in, but really it isn't necessary, and we could eliminate it.
Yeah, and so one of the saddest things, and the book makes clear, and makes me angry, I wrote a little bit about this in Strongman, is that without all these people who live in democracies and wake up and they have all the rights in the world, the wealth managers, the accountants, the lobbying firms that lobby they whitewash, autocracies, the PR firms, and there's a lot of good new books about each of these things, but Anne puts it all together, which is why the book's so valuable. These people make the machinery of autocratic kleptocracy run. And they're all here in democracies.
Maybe not in this room.
No, they're not in this room. So, yeah, and it was a little depressing because my book came out in 2020, so I was doing the research in 2019, and so I'm reading your book, and it's a few years later, and it's like some things have been done against this, but not enough, and there's too many entrenched interests. But without these people, the Putins of the world wouldn't be able to complete their thievery on the scale that they do. So, and Anne has at the end of the book, a kind of menu of things that we can do, and that's on it.
Although they depend on having political leaders who want to do them.
That's right.
And we are at risk of not having that.
Yeah.
Even some of the some of the change to, again, the financial system, the financial reforms, it has been very hard to pass, even with well-meaning. I mean, actually, the Biden administration has talked about, was one of the first, actually, presidential administrations to talk about, kleptocracy as a national security issue. So not just a problem for, banks, but as a problem for national security. And they did talk about it, and there has been some movement in Congress. But it's very slow, and it's never anybody's priority.
Yeah.
I would say that, and certainly, and the other issue, I didn't really go into this at length in the book, but the other issue is, reform of or regulation of social media, making the algorithms transparent, allowing people to own their data, right. Coming up with alternative forms of democratic online communication. I mean, there's a whole realm of ideas people have had about how to fix that. I mean, none of that goes anywhere. Either it's too hard for our politicians to understand, or the pressure from the platforms and their very wealthy owners is too great, but it doesn't move, and nobody's taken it. No. And it could be that the European Union does, because because the European Union is there to regulate, and right. So they think about regulation. They wake up in the morning thinking about regulation. And we don't, but maybe they will.
And Elon Musk certainly doesn't. That's the autocratic fellow traveler, and the goal is to remove all regulation.
Yep.
On that note, I want to, of course, talk about the points of connection of the U.S. Where does it enter into this Autocracy Inc.? With these, countries that we like to think of this kind of almost firewall between autocracy and democracy. And of course, we know that's not the case. It's a continuum. And we also see, and Anne's book makes this clear, there's these transnational networks, not only among autocracies, but what we were just talking about with finance, with illicit finance. All of that is transnational. But can you talk about our situation? What's going to happen to us? But what is, what is
Let me just take out my crystal ball.
We have this weird, we're a bipartisan, nation, and one of our two giant parties is an autocratic entity, and it's...
No, it's not. I wouldn't say the whole party is. I mean, it's true there is now a... So, and this is mostly, I mean, the finance issue is one issue, but there is a part of the part of the Republican Party, which, like the far right in most European countries, right. Sometimes elements of the far left too, which now are very happy with and delighted to work alongside authoritarian narratives. Mm-hmm. So that is and that's a shift from a few years ago. We didn't have that 10 years ago, and we have it now. And I talk a lot in the book about how this works. So there is authoritarian countries, and the members of Autocracy Inc., which is not every dictatorship, but it's a particular group, invest a lot of money in information. Yeah. The Chinese invest tens and probably hundreds of millions of dollars in television, newspapers, in multiple languages, their own, plus they invest in content sharing arrangements with, most countries in Africa. Xinhua, which is the Chinese wire service, is free or very cheap in much of the world. And they think a lot about what goes into, what will be presented. And actually for a long time, the Russian and Chinese and Iranian and other systems were rather separate. More recently, they have begun to borrow one another's ideas, and even, the Chinese network, for example, puts out a lot of Russian propaganda now, which was not the case previously. But they have, some of what they do is just to promote whatever, Chinese trade, and some of it is more ideological. And there is a set of narratives that you can now see repeated around the globe. Some of which talk about how authoritarian, dictatorships are secure and safe and reliable. democracies are divided and weak and degenerate, and sometimes by that they mean sexually degenerate. Alongside that, there's a narrative about traditional families and hierarchy, social hierarchies. Sometimes there's a racial element, sometimes not, depends on where it is. And an attempt to portray, so this is mostly a Russian thing, attempt to portray, for example, Russia and other dictatorships as traditional, reliable places where a normal life can be had, whereas in democracies there's degeneracy and chaos and American carnage. And that kind of language, which you can find, as I said, around the world, and you can also find in, we had a version of it in 2016 here. This was actually pretty primitive now compared to what happens now. It was the use of fake Facebook pages and so on in the 2016 election. It's now more sophisticated. There are the number of outlets is different. A lot of them, and a lot of it is not. We have to stop thinking along the lines of, the Russians are influencing us or they're paying someone to do it. That's not it. We have, a part of our political spectrum is actively interested in those same ideas and copies them and uses them. And there is a kind of meld of authoritarian narratives that come from the authoritarian world and those that are here. And this is not unique to the United States. There's a version of it in Europe. There's a version in France. There's a version in Germany. There's a version in Poland, where I live part of the time. So it's an international phenomenon. And some of it is, you also have to think about this. It's not like there's a secret cabal of, bad people who meet in a room, like in a James Bond movie. They simply watch one another and, this is working, let's do that. There's the Spanish far right, who I wrote a lot about a few years ago. I wrote about them in my previous book, are a political party, a movement. This is called a group called Vox, were created by people who were watching how the far right was succeeding in other places, and they just copied them. And that's, let's try that theme here and this theme there, and we see there was, gun control is not an issue in Spain except in one particular region, or gun rights, so let's do messaging around that because nobody else is doing it. And they kind of picked up themes, immigration, again, traditional families and so on, and anti-feminism, and they put together a package and created their political party that way. So it was almost like a greatest hits, we take from, or the way you create one of the, producers create teenage bands. We need this kind of girl, and we need a blonde girl and a brunette girl and another, and that's how we make. It was literally like that. It was like create a political party that way.
It works on people. And the other thing, Russia Today. My mother was during the pandemic. She lives in a small village in England, in the northwest of England. And during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, she was radicalized. She was like a conservative. She loved the Queen. I have like so many tea towels with the Queen's face on them. That's how I grew up. And during the pandemic, she became radicalized because she started watching Russia Today. And she started parroting Kremlin talking points and going on these rants. And she developed a love. She never mentioned Putin, ever. But she kept talking about Putin, and then she developed this rabid hatred for Biden. And I would say, Mom, this is Kremlin propaganda. And she would say, no, but the announcers are English. And so this is Anne's point, where it's too simplistic to say that the Russians are influencing us. They're enablers, they're fellow travelers, there's a whole apparatus. And so it becomes very difficult for people to, it's about the narratives and not about the provenance, really.
Yeah, the Chinese have this expression, borrowing boats to reach the sea, which means we don't want to use Chinese media to send a message. We want to use whatever Zimbabwean media. We'd rather have a local journalist tell the story rather than someone who's obviously Chinese. And that was, yeah, I don't think Russia Today works so well anymore. Russia Today was originally, the idea of it was that it looked completely normal.
Yeah.
But had little, in a few little key moments, it was different. And then I think after 2014, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it became much more clearly propaganda than it was. But originally it was very successful because it just seemed like a somewhat wackier, I mean, they had now I've forgotten what the slogan was, all the news that other people won't tell, or something like that. It looked normal, but this little attitudinal difference, and then it became more obvious.
Yeah, and they banned it.
It is now banned.
And that's what, and my mother kind of came out of it. Went back to Sky News. Went back to Murdoch, right? So one thing I wanted to ask you is, after all this, some will be surprised, the dedication of your book is for the optimists. And I loved this because when you do this work, it's a funny thing. I can only speak for myself. When you do this work, you're in the heads of these awful leaders and their enablers, but you also are chronicling the very, very brave people who are opposing them, and you know the value and how difficult and the risks, and so what keeps you? Are you optimistic about when you think about, because there is this, we're in the middle of this renaissance of nonviolent protest all over the world. Many, many countries are having the largest protests they've ever had. For some, in Israel, the largest they've ever had, and many others, the largest they've had in decades. And you're in Poland part of the time, and that is incredibly inspirational, what happened in Poland. And if you look at what they did, it has, do you think it could be replicated? Like, are you optimistic?
Well, first of all, in Poland, the lesson is have the mass street protest before the election.
Yeah.
Don't do it afterwards.
Yes.
So then that was if you want to inspire people or pull them together, do it now and not after it's too late. So that was one of the lessons. But I have a sort of mixed feeling about optimism. I am not naturally optimistic. It's kind of, you don't write long books about Stalin if that's what, if you're a happy person, a normal happy person. But I also, came to conclude over the years, and maybe this is also partly to do with having children and teaching. I teach a little bit, so meeting lots of younger people, that it's just very irresponsible to be pessimistic. I can't. How do I tell people who are 30 years younger than me, it's all hopeless, no. And so I believe very much that, and I also say I don't believe that history has laws. So there is no law that says our democracy will end. There is no law that says, I don't know. I've heard people say this is the century for dictatorships. I mean, why? Says who? Almost everything that happens tomorrow or next week, depends on what people do today. So there's always, people can always make a positive contribution, and it's really the actions of many people that make the future different. And probably like you, I do know a lot of people who have been really brave. I mean, we started out, I said something about them at the beginning, and some of them appear in the book. There are a lot of very brave people who have dedicated their lives to making their countries better. And I really appreciate them. And so I dedicated the book to them. That was why.
No, that's really important. And, one of the things that's making me, so alarmed is that when Trump came on the scene and he started this kind of apocalyptic rhetoric, I thought, oh my God, that's so familiar, because that's how Mussolini used to speak, that you kind of create a sense of crisis and despair, and then you become the savior. And so what he's been, and he's really souped this up recently, but he always said the American dream is dead. And even in his, acceptance speech, he had this.
He did it again, on Thursday night.
And so George Bush Jr. was there, and he said, excuse my language, but it's George Bush's language.
Oh, that was after the inaugural address.
The inaugural, that's what I meant, the inaugural. And he said, that was some weird shit.
That was some weird. And this has been Hillary Clinton heard him say that, so
yes.
It's true.
Yes. But I thought
Michelle Obama did too.
It was weird. It was weird in the context of a democracy, but it was not weird in the context of authoritarian rhetoric. So what Trump's been so successful at is it's so sad. As an American, I feel so sad at this. He's convinced tens of millions of people that America is a failed state. That he's used false statistics about crime and the economy, and they think that America is failing. And so democracy, the point is to say that democracy is failing. And so thus, he's praising the strongman leader. The other day, he said that, Xi Jinping rules with an iron fist, and so that's just great, So how do you see this?
No, I mean, it was even more specific in 2016. Trump would sometimes use language that came directly from Russian propaganda. There was a thing about how Hillary was going to start World War III. This was this was a Russian line. And Obama invented ISIS. This was a Russian conspiracy theory. And so he actually used that language. Was one of the things that originally threw me off. I didn't understand where it had come from. And yes, you mentioned his inaugural address. I mean, he did this again on Thursday night at the end of the Republican convention. It was very rambling speech, but it's actually worth. Well, you can't really read it, but you can look at pieces of it. No, it's a kind of. I saw the printout and there was people did transcripts of it. I think there's one in the New York Times. And it's very rambling and strange, but there are a lot of allusions to crisis, disaster, chaos. And that has several purposes. One is, as you say correctly, is to throw, scorn on the whole political system. Because if the political system is a disaster, then we need to clear it out. We need a revolution. We need to destroy it. And we need to bring in something totally different. And it prepares people to accept really major changes like that. And of course, some of the other things that he's done over the years, this sort of attacks on the press and attacks on judges, all of that is, again, what happens in either authoritarian regimes or in illiberal regimes that are heading in that direction, because those are the guardrails. Who can stop, even an elected president? The judges, or the journalists. Who can expose corruption?
That's it.
Journalists or ombudsmen, there are people in the government, in the system. And so if you downgrade them and denigrate them, and in our case, it's in the case of our media, it's become easy because media is so weak now. And so, a lot of companies are very close to bankruptcy. If you downgrade and denigrate them, then then they disappear as an obstacle, and so that is literally the purpose of it. So again, this book is mostly about established autocracies that are already in place. But my previous book and some of the writing I've done is about countries where the democracy is declining, and you know this too. Nowadays, when democracies fail, it's usually not because of a coup d'état. So usually there aren't tanks in the street or like a lieutenant colonel shooting up the presidential palace or whatever. It's usually not like that. Instead, what we see are legitimately elected leaders who slowly undermine their own institutions in order to be able to stay in power longer. And Russia's more complicated and different, but that's kind of what happened there. That's certainly what happened in Hungary. I saw it happening in Poland. It failed, but there was a political party that was seeking to do that, to create a political system in which they couldn't lose elections. And that's, of course, the thing I worry about here, is that we could have a political party in power that was trying to set up a system in which they could no longer lose. And when you change the rules of the game in such a way that only one party can win. And maybe it's a lot of people say or believe that in the United States it's not possible, for our system is very big, which is true, and there are a lot of we have a federal system. So and in a funny way, I was spending some time working on this in the last couple months. In a lot of the state elections and state level or even local level debates in the US are actually better than our national conversation because they're about real things. And I don't know, they're about the local school system or the roads or something. Whereas at the national level, it's so remote from people's lives. It's like this, celebrity battle that doesn't mean that much to people. And that's, I think, part of also why it's kind of declined as a it's sort of spectator sport rather than real politics. I mean, and one more thing actually about in reference to Poland, you asked before about how they won. One of the ways to head off that kind of existential politics where it's my identity versus your identity is precisely that. It's to return the conversation to real things. I mean, if you're in a culture war against someone who, if their team wins, your life is destroyed, then that's not really democratic politics anymore. I mean, if you're arguing over what's the tax rate, or should we fund this thing or that thing, or I don't know, should we have a bigger army or a smaller army? I mean, you can really disagree with people about that. You can be absolutely, completely, I can't accept your vision of the EPA. I mean, that's okay. But you're not going to kill them over that. Whereas you might kill them over, what kind of country do we have? So it's better not to have a political battle over what kind of country this should be, if you can avoid it.
But that's exactly what, and the kind of making Democrats into an existential enemy. That's what we've got now.
Yeah, and by the way, just one more. Sorry, I keep interrupting you, but
no.
That it's very important that that both parties be seen as a complicated, nuanced umbrella, and not, neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party are monolithic. So.
Well, that's part of our, the possibilities and limitations of just having these two huge parties and two parties only in such a large country. And so that's been, from an anti-authoritarian stance, that's been difficult because, for example, you can make these coalitions in other countries to ward off, to kind of do gatekeeping. This happened in 2019 in Italy when Matteo Salvini, this like thuggish, far-right guy, very pro-Putin, he was looking, he wanted to become prime minister, and all the other parties, even parties that didn't really like his party, and also didn't like the other parties, they all got together and they successfully fended him off.
Well, that's what just happened in France. Exactly the same thing.
Exactly.
There was essentially a coalition sprang up in between the first and second round of the elections that blocked the far right.
Thank you. Okay. We are shifting to the Q&A part.
Gosh, I haven't seen those little cards in a long time, index cards. We used to make notes on them and file them in, remember, little boxes?
So, here's an interesting one, because you talked about Venezuela, and there's a lot of very interesting things in the book about this, and that, again, it's a very tragic thing when the leader does not care if his state becomes a failed state. So this question is, what other South American countries are the greatest risk of falling prey to Autocracy Inc? What do other network members stand to gain there in whatever country?
So South America, I mean, this is not my area of expertise at all, stipulate. You may know more than me. So the South American, there are a lot of stable states in South America, more stable than in some other parts of the world. But the economic pressure from Chinese investment, and in some cases from Russian investment or Russian influence, can be felt almost everywhere. Certainly in Brazil. So I had a conversation with a woman who works in Bolivia who told me that she had started speaking a few years ago about the danger posed by, so when you have a big Russian investment, particularly in a poorer country, it very often comes along with corruption. So the Russians will this happened in Hungary, it happened in South Africa. They'll build some big structure, a nuclear power plant or something. And along with the project, they'll corrupt local political parties or political leaders. They'll come in with, their investments often have a political purpose. Mm-hmm. So again, remember, they're big companies, even if they're technically private companies, very often work on behalf of the state, and they're part of Russian foreign policy. And so if they're investing in your country in a big way, there's usually a political reason as well. And she told me that she'd started speaking about this a few years ago, and nobody believed her. That why would it's paranoia. And then she was saying that more people have come around to see that point of view. I mean, I would say it's a threat everywhere. I mean, Mexico. There is an enormous Russian embassy now in Mexico City. There was a lot of certainly kind of narrative collusion between the Russians and AMLO and the previous Mexican president over the war in Ukraine. He was very reluctant to join any democratic coalition or to speak positively. I have a friend who's a Mexican. She's a journalist and democracy activist and university professor, and she went to Ukraine and wrote a lot about Ukraine, and she became the subject of really horrible kind of misogynist attacks on social media, portraying her as a Ukrainian prostitute or something like that. So there was a concerted effort by the Russian embassy to promote the idea of Russian foreign policy and Russian influence in Mexico. So you can get it almost anywhere where there either is a political class or a politician who needs it or wants it. Sometimes it comes along with money. Sometimes, as I said, it's just a kind of narrative boost. The Russians will help you win your election or help you stay in power, and you can get it anywhere. There's nobody who has clear resistance to it except maybe the Baltic states, although even some of them have Russian minorities.
And that goes with the death of ideals and the transactional mentality.
There are a lot of people who would say, I don't know, I'm making this up, but a businessman in Mexico, why shouldn't I take this money and it's good for me and who cares? So anybody who has that mentality is at risk, and that's almost everybody.
Yeah.
I don't mean all people. I mean in all nationalities. I don't think anybody's exceptional.
Here's an interesting one. How come the UN is so cozy with these dictatorships? And I myself have had the question when, because Russia was already, had already started its war on Ukraine, and then it had its turn being the head of the Security Council. And I thought, this is messed up. What kind of what is it for?
No, it doesn't function anymore. The decline began a while ago, but we're really at a point now. So for Russia, for China, for Iran, for other states who are part of this anti-Western or anti-Western is the wrong word. Sorry, anti-democratic network. The effort to change and undermine and even alter the language of the UN has been going on for a long time. I write about this a little bit in the book. Yeah. The Chinese have tried to change the way the UN speaks. They don't want the UN to talk about human rights, which it has had in its founding documents from the very beginning. There's been an effort to undermine UN efforts and institutions at the same time, all the while trying to use them to promote different ideas. So the Chinese want the UN to talk, instead of human rights, they want the UN to talk about sovereignty. And sovereignty is a great word, and it's very good, and it means lots of positive things. But in the specific Chinese international context, sovereignty means we get to do what we want inside our country, and we don't want anyone else to be able to talk about it, certainly not in an international forum. And they've made a lot of effort to shut it down. And so for them, the undermining of the UN and a whole host of other international institutions has been an important way of protecting their power. One of the most effective opposition movements probably in history was the Soviet dissidents in the 70s, the Helsinki movement, created all they did was they formed a group, a movement, who began pointing to the international treaties that the Soviet Union had signed, which all talked about, rights and democracy, and the Helsinki Treaty, but other treaties as well. And they embarrassed the Soviet Union by saying, you signed up to this, why haven't you done it? And they formed this committee that was dedicated to making sure the treaties were fulfilled. And that was such an effective form of politics, and even international politics, that the Russians now want to make sure it can never happen again. And, and if they undermine the significance and power of the UN, that's a way to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, unfortunately, the UN also no longer really reflects the balance of power either. So,
no.
The Security Council.
Okay, can you explain how autocracies only need to make an example of very few citizens to terrorize the rest of the populace into silence and compliance? Yes, that's the famous autocratic game of make an example.
Yeah, no, this is one of my favorite subjects.
Yes,
me too. This is why, so Stalinism, which I've also written about, was a system of mass terror. Thousands of people were arrested for no reason. Their huge concentration camps were created. And one of the innovations of Putinism, very early on, actually, well before most people thought of him as a problem or or even as a dictator, was to single out individuals and harass them as a way of scaring everybody else. And the most 2 or 3 famous examples, one was the murder of Anna Politkovskaya, who was a journalist. Many years ago, there was another, the arrest and 10-year sentence of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was a very wealthy oligarch who developed independent ideas, and he was also arrested. He was, I think, the richest person in Russia at the time. He was arrested. His company was stolen, taken over by people close to Putin. It's now Rosneft, and he was, and that scared everybody else. So modern dictators don't need to do this expensive and bloody mass arrests. Instead, they pinpoint individual people. And the other, even more recent innovation is the use of smear campaigns and social media. So if you target someone, and you target them both with social media harassment, so endless memes, mockery, conspiracy theories, and then you accompany that with state harassment. So you investigate their taxes, you imply that they're corrupt, maybe you invent a sex scandal about them. This is a better way, more effective way of destroying them than just locking them or killing them.
That's right.
Because then you undermine not only them, you undermine their movement, the values they stand for, and so on. And this is something I've talked to a lot of people about who have experienced it.
It's also what Erdogan does in Turkey. He's big surprise. He's very into these insult suits. And the scale of these insult suits, like tens of thousands of ordinary Turkish people have been, it's for a social media post, and most dictators, Putin included, end up having laws against insulting the dignity of the leader and the state. But Erdogan does these insult suits in ways that can seem random, like some people get away with it, others don't. And so that's part of the psychology of authoritarianism, is that you don't know, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And that was very true of the classic dictatorships, which we've written about, but it's also true to some extent of the new authoritarians. And so some people, you never know if you do a social media post whether you're going to get an insult suit, which is a lawsuit that, psychologically and financially is trying to exhaust you. So we had a little bit of this. My husband and I, he's a Polish politician, had some of this in Poland towards the end of the previous government. They were beginning to do these financial investigations of people that were essentially a form of harassment. I mean, there was a kind of fake reason for the investigation, but you still had to hire a lot of lawyers, and you had to spend a lot of time on it, and you had to fill out a lot of forms. And it's one of the things it's very exhausting to feel like the state is your enemy,
and there's a, nobody's listening. The state isn't a sympathetic partner, but they're looking to find a way to pin something on you, and that's an ugly and unpleasant feeling, and I do hope it doesn't happen here.
And well, Trump's done this very effectively, harassing media companies for the same reason. And for example, he sued, although his campaign made an ad, which you probably heard about, where they talk about making a unified Reich, right? So, however, he sued CNN for $450 million because he said that several of their journalists were comparing him to Hitler. And there were...
Like J.D. Vance.
Yes. So there was Jake Tapper, Chris Chalitza, and then one person, CNN Opinion was publishing thousands and thousands of op-eds. Op-ed by me was mentioned on page 1 or 2 of the complaint because it was revealing it talked about his big lie. So when, the reason he was doing this was making an example. And so he's been pursuing, he chooses carefully, who and what he targets to warn the rest of the media companies what could happen to them. And so this is a similar thing that he's done, and it's been quite effective, actually. All right. Oh, we are out of time.
It's 8 o'clock.
It is 8 o'clock. Well, join me in thanking Anne and
thank you, Ruth.
And she will be signing books. So I encourage all of you to go and buy her book and read it. And thank you so much for coming.
And somebody will show me where to go, right?
I think so.